Let's start with a word that sounds boring but explains almost everything that went wrong here: accounting. In finance, when a project fails catastrophically, we usually don't call it a failure. We call it a write-off. It's a polite euphemism for something that burned a lot of money, produced nothing of value, and survives only as a tax deduction and a cautionary tale. In Washington, apparently, they decided to call it the Department of Government Efficiency. DOGE. And yes, that name alone should have been our first warning. This whole thing began with a number so big it should have triggered an automatic reality check. On a stage, under bright lights, in front of a cheering crowd, Elon Musk casually suggested that his new efficiency crusade could cut $2 trillion out of the federal budget. Not over decades. Not through structural reform. Just rip it out. Cleanly. Like pulling weeds from a garden. For context, total U.S. federal spending is around $6.5 to $6.7 trillion a year. Musk wasn't proposing trim. He was proposing amputation. And here's the thing, almost no one stopped him. Politicians nodded. The crowd applauded. Commentators repeated the number. Social media clipped it into bite-sized inspiration porn. Finally, people said, someone who understands efficiency. But efficiency in government is not the same thing as efficiency in a factory. And that distinction, basic, boring, deeply unsexy, turns out to be the entire story. If you actually open the federal budget, really open it, not skim a pie chart, you immediately run into a brick wall. Roughly 65% of federal spending is mandatory: Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. These are not programs you optimize. They are legal obligations written into statute. Another 10% is interest on the national debt. You don't efficiency hack interest unless you're planning to default and set global financial markets on fire. That leaves about 25% as discretionary spending, and roughly half of that goes to defense. So when someone promises $2 trillion in cuts without touching entitlements or defense, they are either lying, ignorant, or assuming Congress, courts, and reality itself will politely step aside. DOGE assumed the third. Here's where things get interesting, and quietly dishonest. DOGE claimed savings not by measuring cash that stopped leaving the Treasury, but by counting something called ceiling values in government contracts. That's not money spent. That's money that could have been spent if everything went perfectly wrong. Cancel a contract with a $3 billion ceiling that was only costing $100 million a year? DOGE counted the full $3 billion as savings. This wasn't a one-off mistake. It was the methodology. That's like canceling a credit card with a $20,000 limit and announcing you just saved $20,000. You didn't. You just removed the possibility of spending. And when journalists did the unglamorous work of checking the Treasury's daily statements, the government's actual checking account, something awkward appeared. Spending didn't fall. It rose. Day after day, withdrawals averaged around $30 billion, showing no meaningful decline compared to the previous year. DOGE's cuts were invisible where it mattered most, the actual flow of money. The supertanker didn't turn. It sped up. Nowhere was this confusion between cost and value clearer than at the IRS. DOGE proudly pushed for layoffs, fewer tax agents, fewer auditors, fewer bureaucrats. On paper, this looked like savings. In reality, the Congressional Budget Office estimates that reducing IRS enforcement capacity costs the government tens of billions in lost revenue over the next decade. One estimate cited losses of $64 billion simply because there weren't enough people to chase tax evasion. This is basic economics. Sometimes you spend $1 to collect 5. Firing the collectors doesn't make the system leaner. It makes it poorer. And the operational chaos was almost comic. Tax returns piled up. Cafeterias were repurposed as paper storage. Digitization projects stalled or died. A free file system that actually helped ordinary Americans was quietly put on the chopping block. DOGE wasn't trimming fat. It was cutting muscle. Then there was foreign aid, the one area where DOGE actually did slash spending. USAID was effectively fed into what Musk himself described as a wood chipper. Staff fired, contracts canceled, programs halted. On paper, DOGE claimed roughly $45 billion in savings, about 0.6% of federal spending. Politically, this played well. Foreign aid is unpopular. Viral clips circulated claiming absurd things, like the US sending $50 million worth of condoms to Hamas, which was false. The funds were for HIV prevention in Mozambique's Gaza province, not the Gaza Strip. The correction arrived late. The damage was already done. The irony is sharp. DOGE destroyed a relatively small budget item while leaving the structural drivers of deficits untouched, and in the process weakened U.S. soft power, disrupted humanitarian programs, and angered allies. Cheap savings. Expensive fallout. Here's the quiet truth that got lost in the spectacle: DOGE was never a real department. Congress didn't create it. No statute authorized it. Legally, it was an advisory committee, a descendant of earlier commissions that produced thick reports no one read. But Musk didn't do reports. He did firings. Through executive orders, pressure, and sheer institutional bullying, DOGE acted like a corporate raider inside a constitutional system that wasn't designed for hostile takeovers. Consultants usually make slides. DOGE made chaos. And chaos, as it turns out, is not the same thing as reform. Here's the uncomfortable truth: DOGE didn't fail because Elon Musk is uniquely reckless or incompetent. It failed because it was built on a fantasy that Americans want to believe. That fantasy is this: government is just a badly run company. If you put a real businessman in charge, everything will suddenly work. It sounds intuitive. It sounds clean. It sounds American. It's also wrong. Let's slow down and name the core mistake. A business exists to maximize profit under constraints. A government exists to allocate risk, enforce obligations, and provide continuity, even when it's inefficient. Those are not the same problem. In a company, if a department loses money, you shut it down. In government, some departments exist precisely because shutting them down would be catastrophic. The National Weather Service doesn't make money. The FAA doesn't scale efficiently. The IRS doesn't generate profit in the private sector sense, but without it, the state collapses. DOGE treated all of these as cost centers. The state treats them as load-bearing institutions. And load-bearing institutions don't like chainsaws. DOGE's rhetoric worked because waste is a magical word. Everyone hates waste. No one agrees on what it means. Ask 10 Americans what government waste is, and you'll get answers like foreign aid, DEI programs, bureaucrats, paperwork, people I don't like getting benefits. But here's the problem: most federal spending is boring, automatic, and legally mandated. Social Security checks go out whether you like them or not. Medicare bills get paid whether Congress is in session or not. Interest gets paid unless the US wants to default. So DOGE went hunting where it could, not where it mattered. That's how you end up with a spectacle where cutting IRS staff increases the deficit. Gutting USAID saves less than 1% of spending. Canceling already empty contracts produces headline savings with no cash impact. DOGE wasn't cutting waste. It was cutting visibility. And visibility is easier to manipulate than math. One of the most revealing details from the DOGE saga wasn't political at all, it was accounting. DOGE repeatedly claimed savings based on maximum contract ceilings, not actual expenditures. Investigations showed that many of these contracts were either inactive, underused, or already winding down. This matters because it exposes something deeper: most people don't understand how government money actually moves. Press releases talk about budgets. Reality runs on cash flow. And the Treasury's daily cash flow showed no meaningful reduction, even as DOGE flooded social media with receipts and dashboards. That disconnect didn't slow the hype. It accelerated it. Because DOGE wasn't selling fiscal reform. It was selling vibes. Why Americans love the CEO-president idea. This story is bigger than Musk. America has been obsessed with the idea of the CEO as savior for decades. Names like Ross Perot, Michael Bloomberg, Donald Trump, and now, Elon Musk adjacent power fantasies. The logic is always the same: they ran a business. Government must be easier than that. But government is harder, not because it's inefficient, but because it's deliberately constrained. A CEO answers to shareholders. A president answers to Congress, courts, states, voters, treaties, and history. DOGE tried to bypass all of that with startup culture and executive swagger. The system responded the only way it can, with friction, lawsuits, delays, and quiet resistance. What DOGE interpreted as bureaucratic sabotage was actually constitutional gravity. Let's return briefly to the IRS, because it perfectly captures the DOGE illusion. DOGE framed IRS staff as parasitic bureaucrats. In reality, IRS enforcement returns multiple dollars for every dollar spent. When DOGE pushed cuts, the projected loss in tax revenue dwarfed the salary savings. Estimates ran into tens of billions over a decade. This is the difference between cost-cutting and value destruction. DOGE couldn't tell the difference because startups rarely deal with systems where enforcement creates revenue indirectly. Governments do. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Despite everything, DOGE was popular at first. Polls showed overwhelming support for cutting government waste. The symbolism, chainsaws, spreadsheets, viral clips, resonated deeply. Why? Because DOGE gave emotional satisfaction. It punished institutions people distrust. It embarrassed elites. It looked decisive in a system that feels slow. Whether it worked was secondary. DOGE functioned less as a reform project and more as political theater, a live-action demonstration of contempt for the administrative state. In that sense, it succeeded at exactly what it was best at. DOGE didn't end with a bang. No report. No scorecard. No reconciliation between claims and reality. It simply vanished. Reuters later confirmed that the initiative no longer existed as an entity, its remnants absorbed back into the bureaucracy it was meant to conquer. That ending is telling. Because real reforms leave paperwork. They leave statutes. They leave durable changes. DOGE left vibes, clips, and a cautionary tale. Here's the final twist. The United States absolutely does have efficiency problems like outdated systems, paper-based processes, fragmented agencies, perverse incentives. But fixing those problems requires upfront investment, long timelines, legal coordination, and yes, more spending before less spending. DOGE promised shortcuts. And shortcuts are seductive, until you realize they mostly cut corners that were holding the building up. DOGE wasn't a tragedy. It was a parable. A parable about how badly Americans want simple answers. How little patience we have for institutional complexity. And how easily efficiency becomes a slogan instead of a discipline. The next DOGE will come. It will have a different name. A different personality. A different color scheme. And unless Americans learn to tell the difference between reform and performance, it will end the same way. Quietly. Expensively. And with absolutely nothing to show for it.